Good evening and good morning, everyone. I'm Jean Oy. I'm the professor of political science and also the honor of being the director of the Stanford China program. I want to welcome you to the beginning of our fall series. This fall, we are also we're going to be continuing our focus on U.S. China relations. And obviously, I think this is something that is very timely, and it's a period when U.S.-China relations remains quite tense. Um, and so that before I get in today's program, I just want to give you an alert that in about 2 weeks, we're going to be having Peter Martin, the political correspondent for Bloomberg News, giving a talk on the wolf warrior diplomacy. So it's a much more sort of modern, development, tracing the roots of China's contemporary diplomatic corps. But today's program, I think we have a very special event. And that is that we're going to go back because we have a series of experts who are really some of the key figures to document U.S. China relations and actually participants in U.S. China relations, talking about their newly issued volume titled Engaging China, 50 Years of Sino-American Relations. And this was a volume that was edited by Anne Thurston. And I just want to highlight that this, I think, will give us a rare opportunity to go back and sort of take stock into different aspects of what has happened over the past 50 years. And clearly, this is a very important book. And I was just found out that this book apparently was sold out even before it was published this past summer. And Anne tells me that the second printing is already sold out. So I encourage you to go to Amazon and get your copies. I'm not going to take up any more time because I am very fortunate to have Tom Fingar, who is part of this volume and who is a key participant in the development of U.S.-China relations, say a few more words about the volume and introduce our very distinguished speakers. Tom is my colleague in APARC. He's a APARC fellow, but he also spent a long time in Washington. Among his many titles, he was the Deputy Director of National Intelligence and the concurrently chairman of National Intelligence Council. And I will put a plug in for his new book because we can read about all of his adventures in a book that is coming out with Stanford University Press, From Mandate to Blueprint, Lessons of Intelligence Reform. He also happens to be my co-author of a volume on Fateful Decisions, talking about China's reform process. And with that, I'm just going to turn it to you, Tom.
Hey, thank you, Jean, for the introduction. Thank you to Jean and the China program for arranging this book talk. That all of us who are participating are delighted, not only for the chance to talk about the book, but for the chance to be back together on a single program. We have been friends and colleagues for 5 decades. We began in graduate school when we were 3 of us at Stanford and at Berkeley, but all part of the single Stanford-Berkeley Center for East Asian Studies, because somebody in the 1960s looked at a map and thought Berkeley and Stanford were close together, not realizing that distance out in the Bay Area is measured in minutes, not miles, and Berkeley is far away. But it is wonderful to be together with these colleagues. That in order to maximize time for discussion, I will provide only minimal introductions here that you've seen or certainly have access to biographic information on all of us in the announcements for this program. That we're going to begin with Anne Thurston, who edited the volume, and we'll talk about its origins and give an overview so you'll know how the other chapters fit into that larger work. Anne is a political scientist who has spent her career telling the stories of ordinary Chinese who found themselves in rather extraordinary circumstances. Her books include Enemies of the People, A Chinese Odyssey, and The Private Life of Chairman Mao. She did not interview Chairman Mao, but is telling the story of Mao's longtime personal physician. That after Anne gives the overview and introduction, I will speak on the origins and the logic of the policy and process that we call engagement. I will then turn the program over to Mary Bullock, PhD in history from Stanford. Among other positions she has held for more than a decade, director of the Committee on Scholarly Communication, the People's Republic of China, the president of Agnes Scott College, and the executive vice chancellor of the Duke Kunshan University. She's the author of An American Transplant, the Rockefeller Foundation, and Peking Union Medical College. And finally, we'll turn it over to David, or as all of us know him, Mike Lampton, a fellow Stanford political science PhD. Mike, besides being an academic university teacher, served for a decade as president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, a director of the China program at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and has edited or written many books, including most recently Rivers of Iron, but also Follow the Leader and Same Bed, Different Dreams. You can find a more extensive list of publications with them. That a note for students as we begin this discussion, and that is, it's worth noting that all of those speaking today have had careers that transcend the normal distinction between an academic career and careers as activists, organizers, participants in the rebuilding and the deepening and the sustaining of the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. A lot of us began our careers coming out of the Vietnam anti-war movement, determined not to let anything like that happen again if we could help it, to use our academic training and the networks of people that we interact with for the benefit of our country, of China and Chinese people and others in the region. And this book, I was going to say is an attempt. This book succeeds in capturing many, many dimensions of this 50-year endeavor. And with that, I will turn it over to Anne Thurston.
So thank you, Tom, for that lovely introduction to all of us. It really is good to be back together with so many good friends from Stanford. As the editor of this book, it is now my job to sort of describe how the book came about and to give you some of the highlights of the book. The book began shortly after Mike Lampton, who is with us today, announced that he would soon be retiring from SAIS, the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he had been the director of the China Studies program for some 20 plus years. And upon that announcement, several of his colleagues, including most particularly Carla Freeman and Madeline Ross, decided that we needed to find a way to pay homage to Mike for all of his service, not just to the China Studies program at SAIS, but also to the China Studies field as a whole. And they determined that the best way to do that would be through a book. And very often when esteemed professors at universities retire, a book is written in their honor. It's usually called a Festschrift, and it's usually filled with glowing praise of the retiring professor, but not very much content. In fact, I have one such book about another retiring Johns Hopkins Science professor. But Mike didn't want a Festschrift. He didn't want a book that was going to be glowing with the praises of him. He wanted something that was serious and scholarly and about China. So Carla and Madeline came to me and explained the situation and wondered whether I would be willing to take leadership of such a book, of putting such a book together. We knew from the beginning that it would be a multi-authored book, that it would have a number of contributors. And we certainly knew immediately that it would be a book about U.S. China relations, largely because in honor of Mike Lampton, who was for many years, he was the president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, which was just key to the period of engagement that we are talking about. We knew pretty quickly that that's what the book would be about. And we knew also that in order to do this book, we wanted just the best people that we could find. And Tom has described something about them, people with long experience in the China field, some of whom had worked in government, some of whom had worked in academia, some of whom had worked in non-governmental organizations, and many of whom had gone back and forth between the public sector and academia and the government, including those of you who are here tonight. So I sort of put together a sort of list of people who I thought would be the most appropriate and best contributors to the volume, came up with sort of subjects for them to write about, contacted them, and I think virtually everybody agreed. And the first big stage of the book was that we had a conference in Wisconsin, in Wingspread in Racine, Wisconsin, where we brought all of the authors together to present their papers and to have us all discuss it. And at the end of that, Mary doesn't agree with me that it seemed to me that the book, that we surely had a book, but certainly shortly after that, we decided that we really had a book. And people signed on to work with it, and I edited it. And for those of you who are published yourselves, you probably know that it's very difficult to get a multi-authored volume published, but we were very, very fortunate that Columbia University was quickly very, very happy with the book and decided to take it on. And so it was been published by Columbia University Press. I think it is an important book. I think it's an excellent book. I'm very proud of the people who participated in it. I just want to highlight two things that I think make it very special. One of them is that it doesn't consider engagement between China and the United States as just state-to-state relationships. It includes non-governmental organizations, it includes academics, it includes particularly non-governmental organizations and people who've been working with the U.S. China relations for a long period of time. So what you come up with is a very complex, the very complex nature of engagement. We learned from the chapters that engagement was always difficult. There were always problems. There were always obstacles. Things went back and forth, but always in the end, it seemed that engagement and this relationship was worth all of the effort. So the second thing is that, I mean, I think the combination of having it be so multifaceted and bringing just such good people to the question is what makes it such a good book. So I hope you all will buy it. And now I will turn this back to Tom for his presentation.
Now, during the last few years, engagement has frequently been described as misguided, static, but neither of these characterizations is accurate. Engagement was and is both a policy framework that was designed to shape and to mesh with Beijing's goals and methods of interaction with the United States, and a multifaceted process to achieve American objectives. I'm going to focus on the origins, objectives, and the logic of what we now call engagement. The policy framework dimension of this was shaped by time-tested US Cold War practices, but it was also shaped by the perception of new opportunities to pursue very long-standing US objectives with respect to China. The two primary triggers for adoption of the approach were Soviet power. This was the period in which the Soviet Union's power, reach, and ambitions were at their maximum, but also perceived opportunities resulting from Beijing's emerging shift from Maoist autarky to what became known as Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening strategy of development. Signs that China was moving toward adoption of an export-led growth or an Asian tiger model of development persuaded Washington that a new approach to China could enhance US security, open China's economy to American business, and facilitate access to the Chinese people and civil society. Now, initially, engagement was intended to shape Chinese thinking by signaling that if Beijing actually adopted policies later described as reform and opening, the US would support and assist China's quest to achieve stability, prosperity, and modernization. Modernization by working with and within the US-led free world order. The decision to extend access to the People's Republic of China was not the result of naivete or altruism. On the contrary, it was a classic realpolitik decision to make China a stronger, more capable, and more committed partner in the then seemingly never-ending struggle with the Soviet Union, while at the same time realizing century-long American commercial and civil society goals. The new approach to China essentially moved China from the adversary side of the US policy playbook that made countries subject to containment to the partner side, where countries were eligible for the benefits of interaction. Granting such benefits was not altruistic because it made the United States more secure, more prosperous, and more influential by helping our partners to become wealthier and more capable. Stronger partners made the anti-Soviet coalition stronger and increased the security of all members, certainly including the United States. Bringing China into the, quote, free world club in this way without requiring or expecting rapid political change meant that Washington did not have to invent entirely new or unique policies for China. It simply had to apply well understood and proven methods of participation in the US-led rules-based order. By the late 1970s, the Cold War playbook had evolved incrementally through the incorporation of new lessons and pursuit of new opportunities. Engagement with China utilized practices developed during 4 decades of interaction with our European and East Asian partners. No one called that earlier interaction engagement, but that is what it was. Because the policies and policy instruments were well understood by 1978, it was relatively easy to apply them to China. A central feature of these policies was their reliance on non-governmental actors. Unlike China, the United States conducts most interactions with foreign economies and societies by facilitating the development of ties between firms, universities, professional societies, research institutes, and myriad other non-federal institutions. Washington opens the door for private sector and state entities to pursue their own interests. The federal government also forged ties between bureaucratic agencies, including the military, but their scope and magnitude pale in comparison to those of non-governmental actors. Given the nature of our constitutional and federal system, utilization of non-federal mechanisms is more than possible. It's imperative. Moreover, as we learned from Cold War interaction with the Soviet Union, limiting forms of engagement or interaction to those negotiated between governments had almost no impact on Soviet thinking, institutions, or society. Engagement with China was designed to capitalize on the multiplicity, diversity, and capacity of American society. It was also designed to build relationships quickly. Speed was important because Washington was eager to demonstrate that engagement with the United States and the free world more broadly would bring concrete benefits to China and the Chinese people. Again, the motivation was not altruistic. It was to lock in reform and opening policies, lest they be abandoned as quickly as were policies adopted during the Maoist era. We wanted to unleash the beneficial and transformative effects of interaction with American people, institutions, and ways of doing things. Speed was not the only reason for promoting a multiplicity of relationships. Two others were to forge networks of relationships involving multiple and diverse actors on both sides of the Pacific, and to build constituencies with a stake in the relationship on both sides. We understood from the beginning that strains and conflicting interests inevitably would make it difficult to sustain the new relationship, and that the common enemy pillar supporting the limited relationship established by Nixon and Mao needed to be reinforced. For that reason, the United States sought to complement the security pillar with trade, investment, health-related, educational, and many other ties so that the foundation of the bilateral relationship would remain sound, even when frictions in specific pillars or areas of interaction were high. Similarly, building multiple constituencies with a stake in the relationship, and in the United States, the ability to pursue their interest through the political system, would sustain and shape the overall relationship. It was no accident that the business community became the strongest and most effective advocate of a stable U.S.-China relationship. Engagement was never designed specifically to achieve regime change, even though Chinese then and now believe that to have been a core American objective. It was, however, designed to achieve modernization, which is transformative, and to enmesh China in the rules-based order in a way that would make it increasingly costly to withdraw. As Mary and Mike will illustrate, the approach was quite successful. Now pass the microphone to Mary Bullock.
Okay. Well, I would also like to thank Tom and Jean and my colleagues for this session. As the book makes clear, engagement means different things. I think it's complex, it's messy, and it is multifaceted. There is nothing premeditated on either side. Tom makes this very clear. I think I like his terms. They're more in the article than maybe he said today. But I do like his terms, evolutionary and iterative. My own chapter is part of this section on people-to-people relations, and it includes chapters on students by Robert Daly and on health by Yanzhi Wang. I have called my own chapter strategic adaptation. Adaptation because 40 or 50 years ago, American foundations, religious organizations, and very importantly, NGOs have continually adapted their mission in order to work in China. Strategic because they wanted to be in China, even as China changed. The American role began slowly in the 1970s. I think we were all there in the 1970s and 1980s. And then it escalates in the 1980s and 90s and the first decade of the new century. I discuss 4 areas in particular: the environment, religious organizations, politics, and I use the National Committee as an overarching umbrella American organization. You know, in rereading my own work and the book as a whole, I don't think we pay enough attention to the role that takes place, the changes that take place in Chinese society, and how these changes in China have affected American activity. More than other areas, let's say commerce or diplomacy, as Chinese society matures and becomes more sophisticated, this evolution has certainly affected American involvement. In a sense, this is what Tom calls modernization. It would have occurred without and regardless of who was in charge, regardless of leadership. In my own case, massive, and I mean massive, Chinese government funding for knowledge infrastructure and also for social services signal less of a need for foreign assistance, less need for foreign input as in the past. Toward the end of my own article, I focus on the 2017 Foreign Ngo Law. All people who want to work in China, who want to register an office, must secure the support of a Chinese government supervisory unit. Now, this law is not unique to China. A number of countries have ways to limit or supervise NGO activity. But this law and the lead up to it does result in the slowing down, the changing, and even today, the ending of many forms of American activity in China. Here, this is where Chinese leadership does make a difference. It is now the Chinese leadership is opposed to domestic or international organizations which are involved in advocacy activities, whether these are political or humanitarian. This thrust affects Chinese NGOs or Gongos, which are all related to the state. They must refrain from domestic advocacy activities. And most American organizations were involved with Chinese Gongos. I think international organizations, if they remain in China, are asked to assist Chinese organizations as they, quote unquote, go out, as they try to improve China's soft power abroad. Now, clearly this has pluses and minuses. and we can discuss this in the session that follows. But I think taking a step back, we have to realize that for a half of a century, American social organizations worked with Chinese government and also increasingly with grassroots organizations. American organizations often focused on training, whether state ministries, religious leaders, academics, or even activists. They were often experimental. They were usually very local. And they brought global norms to their various endeavors. Hundreds of organizations and thousands upon thousands of American individuals were involved, deeply and successfully involved. Even as China has become more authoritarian and eschews today many American connections, it has also become more humanitarian. Today, some American social organizations remain in China. I have talked to people in the Ford Foundation. I know that the Asia Foundation continues. But their activity is slowed, and what they do must be congruent with Chinese government priorities. This is not new, but Chinese government expectations and priorities have changed. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Mike.
Well, thank you, all the preceding speakers, and I want to thank the Stanford China program and Jean Oy and Tom for their work in organizing this. Also want to thank Stanford for providing me in the years 2019-20 the opportunity to write and study and interact with the Stanford community. And this chapter was in this book, one of the fruits of that time. So I do want to thank Stanford and acknowledge its help in all respects. As Tom said at the opening, one motivation for this book was what I would call an emerging first draft of history that has the period we roughly call engagement described as a naive strategy, one that emphasized markets, dialogue, relatively congenial terms of entry for China into global organizations, all in, as this narrative would have it, in the misplaced hope that we would produce a kinder, gentler, more democratic China. And because that doesn't really describe the condition we face in our relationship with China and Chinese domestic and foreign behavior, of course, the critics have declared the engagement strategy to have been a failure that probably in the long run was not compatible with long-term American interests. I think one of the major purposes really of this book was to examine rigorously from a number of perspectives and disciplines that narrative. And in the interest of time and getting to all your questions, I just want to really make two sets of points that I think certainly my concluding chapter make, but I think are woven into the fabric of the book. Not everybody agrees with all of the propositions. There's a good diversity of views within the book, but I would make 2 points that I think capture the thrust of many of the chapters, not least my own. Well, point one is that, and I think it was implicit in what, not implicit, explicit in what Tom said, is that engagement was not a strategy. It was a happening. This was not just capital to capital relations, but it was society to society relations. And when the Nixon visit happened and then the Carter normalization, at that time I was out in Ohio And we happen to have a governor in late 1970s and early 80s, Governor Jim Rhodes, a conservative governor in a conservative state. But he was one of the first local leaders to make a major investment in trying to establish commercial relations with China. And he did it not because it had anything to do with anti-Soviet leverage and coalition. He didn't do it because he thought democracy was going to emerge anytime soon in China. He did it because he saw the potential for commercial benefit for Ohio in the period of the Rust Belt and economic difficulty. And he first brought in Japanese investment, but he ultimately brought in Chinese investment. And just for example, in the sort of Rust Belt area around Dayton, Chinese investments come in. The auto industry in both Detroit and Dayton, Detroit, Michigan, and Dayton, Ohio, all had tremendous employment effects by Japanese or Chinese investment. So what you had really is this replicated across all of the interest groups in our society, whether it was Christian churches that saw the opportunity to connect with potential co-religionists in China, whether it was universities that were either looking for students or research assistants or for teachers in their Chinese language sections. The point is that our interest diversified society each saw its own possibilities in establishing a China connection. And in a very real way, I don't want to exaggerate, but in a sense in China and in the United States, the central government in a sense lost control of the relationship. Now, of course, the central government in China's always had a greater span of control than in the United States. And certainly the United States government, central government, can exert its control in national interest and security areas. But basically a very important, if not the dominant dynamic, was this bottom-up character of the US system. The second thing I think you want to say about this bottom-up character is that, and in the vein of this isn't a strategy, it was a happening, some people assert, some of the critics assert, that the United States made the wrong choices along the way by way of being too, let us say, respectful of Chinese interest to the maybe not sufficient recognition of American interests. But along with this idea of this not being a choice, a strategic choice, I think another way to look at choice is that this was from the 1970s on was a sequence of choices that reality forced on the US government. To put it bluntly, I think if you were in the US government or in a position of thinking strategically about the US-China relationship, you have to ask yourself, in the last 40 or 50 years, when was it really realistic? When would it have made sense to get tougher and potentially have more conflictual relationship with China? And I would argue all along the way, the US had other priorities that made getting along with China and accommodating to a certain extent a logical choice. So for instance, in 1997, 98, would we have chosen to confront China in the era of the Asian financial crisis? China was very helpful during the Asian financial crisis. Would we have chosen a 9/11? As the convenient time to get tougher on China? We were certainly getting sucked into the Middle East, Central Asia, and so on. Would we have chosen the global financial crisis in 2008 and 9? That was a time when we needed China's help. So much of the critique of engagement sort of implies we had free choice just to turn up the leverage on China, leaving aside whether it would have been effective. The point is, we had other national priorities, and China was always part of a much larger global foreign policy set of issues. So point one is in a way, engagement wasn't a strategy. It was a happening of a concatenation and sequence of events over time, and a concatenation of interest group, bottom up kind of activity. So I think that's the first thing to say. Now, point two, I think, is the one of the central points of my chapter, and Tom asked me to talk a bit about it, and that is, when all is said and done, right now we're in a national dialogue of why, what were the downsides of engagement, and there were many, and I'm sure we'll talk about them, and the book does at great length. But I think insufficient attention has been devoted to what were the upsides, what were the gains. And if you go back to that, my assertion that a lot of the dynamism came from the bottom up kind of interest group character, you have to look for the benefits of the relationship in the building blocks of our society, the different sectors, administrative levels, NGOs, and so forth. So I want to just remind all of us of what were some of the important gains that we made. I remember it was when I was out at Stanford in, I think it was 2020, but at least during my stay there, the former Energy Secretary, Steve Chu, spoke in one of our meetings. And apropos of this idea about not overlooking the gains, he says, when we start talking about policy towards Chinese students, collaborative research, science and technology cooperation, let's remember that as we tighten up on export controls or visa policies and so on, we are going to have a lot of opportunity costs in terms of all of the talent and innovation that the previous years of engagement and student and university collaboration produced. So you have to think about the opportunity costs of a tougher policy on China. And I very much agreed with Steve Chu in that sense. Also, there were other kinds of benefits. I was just listening to Robert Daly, who's the head of the Kissinger Institute at the Wilson Center yesterday, and he talked about a scholar at Purdue University, a person named Juan Xiaolin. He's a mechanical engineer. He got his BA and MA at Tsinghua, but his PhD in the United States at the University of Michigan. And he's invented a white paint, the whitest paint in the world. It reflects 98% of sunlight and could be a very important part of a comprehensive solution to global warming. Who knows what would have happened had he never gone to the University of Michigan and then be working at Purdue University. It's much more well known, another whole category of events the World Bank has documented for the last 40 years, and that is that up until 2 years ago, 850 million people had been lifted from poverty in China. Certainly not all because of U.S. China engagement, mostly the hard work of the Chinese people, but certainly our basic policy for the last 40 years has been supportive of that transformative, as Tom said, modernization. Also, you can't forget that during the Cold War, the two biggest hot wars of the Cold War were Vietnam and Korea, and both of those had something to do with China. If you look to the agricultural sector of the United States and you just look at the number of agricultural states, agriculture has been a huge gainer in the engagement period. In fact, I've paid attention just to, over all the years because I was in Ohio and dealt a lot in the Middle West. But I always recall that Governor Branstad of Iowa, who was our ambassador under President Trump to China, used to say 1 out of 3 rows of soybeans in Iowa goes to China. That was about $13 billion a year, which was the same export value as the annual export value of Boeing aircraft. And speaking of Boeing aircraft, of course, 1 out of every 6 planes that rolled off the assembly line from Boeing went to China. But I would say also, interestingly, Boeing, and for this matter, Airbus, cooperated with China to build a safe air traffic control system. And when all of us on this program first went to China, flying in China wasn't all that safe. So, but it was self-interested in the sense that, of course, foreigners and Americans would fly in China. That's most directly the case. But also, you can't put a lot of aircraft in the air if you can't manage them safely. So if we were going to have the commercial benefits, we had to cooperate with China on air safety, and it was very effective. Just a whole nother area is the area of world nutrition. Mary will know, because it was the Committee on Scholarly Communications, the National Academy of Engineering and National Academy of Sciences ran a program to reduce post-harvest food loss in fruits and vegetables. And China, to make a long story short, lost half its fruits and vegetable between the time it was picked and before it got to the dinner table. Well, now that's been reduced 30 or 40%, not all because our little National Academy program, but we engaged in American industry to work together with Chinese industry to reduce food loss in China. That contributed to expansion of available food in the world, and I think had many positive outcomes. I'll just conclude on that note by just emphasizing, and Tom and Mary mentioned health cooperation. But until the COVID, I will say, fiasco, and frankly, the Chinese whitewash of the initial origins of the pandemic, health and pandemic cooperation between the United States and China had actually been excellent. And in the chapter by Huang Yanzhong, he in fact refers to the period 2002 to 2016 as the golden age of health cooperation between the United States and China. So I would just wind up by saying it's not that all the problems that we all can identify and do identify in the book are unreal, unimportant, that we shouldn't learn from those problems. But on the other hand, if you're going to have a cost-benefit analysis, you got to look at the benefits. And I guess the long and the short of it is, I think we're paying more attention to the costs and insufficient attention to the benefits. Tom?
Thank you, Mike. Thanks to Anne and to Mary also for the presentations. We've covered a great deal in the a little more than a half hour that we've been speaking. There's far more in the book. And I urge people to buy the book, certainly to look at the book. We are beginning to get questions. I invite anybody in our happily very large audience to pose questions in the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many as we can. Let me begin by reading a question or summarizing a question, and invite, I think this one may be yours, Mary, that what's the status of Confucius Institutes? Are they considered examples of government agencies? Are they beneficial to the US or just primarily disseminators of propaganda? There's more, but that's the heart of it.
Well, my own experience is that there is a tremendous variety of Confucius Institutes. I think of one in South Carolina, for example, where they wouldn't have had any kind of Chinese language program without a Confucius Institute. But for the most part, Americans have turned their back on Confucius Institutes, and Confucius Institutes are seen, and I think they are, inappropriate government intrusions into university life. They are not Alliance Française, which stands apart from the university. They do require some university participation, and that is a problem. However, I think that the effort which used to be made to link Confucius Institutes at American universities with minority institutions with different places in China was for the most part good. Tom?
I'll have a standing invitation to Anne and to Mike and to myself to chime in on any of these questions and answers if you wish to do so. If not, I'll go on to the next question. Okay, this one,
Tom?
Mike, yes, Mike.
Yeah, on the Confucius Institute issue, I think, and I think Mary partly emphasized this, but they had greater or lesser benefit depending on what institutions you're talking about.
Yes.
And on the areas that a Confucius Institute and various universities and colleges might be operating. I think that when they stuck in the area of language study, there were many small liberal arts colleges and in fact some high schools in the city of Chicago that were supplied, they were called Confucius classrooms that got Chinese teachers. And I think on balance that was positive. Of course, you can always talk about what are the materials being used and are they balanced and are they carrying a message? Those are all important. But on balance, I think a lot of small institutions found the language component to be useful. And I think in some institutions I'm acquainted with would be upset at their demise. And by the way, not all Confucius Institutes have been scrapped, although it's a growing and significant number. On the other hand, I would say the big universities and that want to have a balanced, large, diverse public affairs program, it becomes kind of problematic because the Confucius Institute doesn't want to get crosswise, frankly, with the Chinese government on a number of topics. So you take, for example, most Confucius Institutes probably would not choose to invite the representative of the Dalai Lama to talk about Tibet and so forth. And those are real constraints, and institutions that have the wherewithal and want a big public affairs kind of program, the constraints are just going to wreck the credibility of the program. And I can just say in the context of Johns Hopkins, when we had the choice of considering having an institute, we decided we'd rather put our efforts into our own institutional joint venture in China than get embroiled in additional, and in this case, Confucius Institute. I think we have not regretted that decision.
Let me pick up on a part of that question that I did not read, which basically asks if the United States had anything in China comparable to the Confucian. And the answer is no. But I want to use this to make a larger point that I referenced in my opening remarks. When the US applied to China its Cold War playbook, an important part of that playbook was US acceptance of and exploitation of our economic, our educational, financial, and a lot of other advantages. That whether it was with our NATO allies, Japan, or China, after China was invited to join this process, was US acceptance of asymmetry. We would grant to others access to the United States that we didn't expect or demand that they would grant to us. It was not China specific. There is US questioning of why now, more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War, we are maintaining that kind of asymmetry. Why shouldn't we have more reciprocity in these relationships? So China took advantage of, or was enabled to use, a deliberate aspect of American policy, sending more students here than we sent there, as opposed to with the Soviet Union, one poet for one poet, one physicist for one physicist. That it was a very deliberate strategy that is now being questioned primarily with respect to China, because China is so big. But the core element of the policy was China was extended opportunities that had been developed with very close allies. Let me pick up, this is a Tom Gold question that's partly directed to Mary, but I'm going to respond to this one as well. Having to do with how hard-nosed we were in setting up academic exchanges. Tom's question is, didn't the United States want to have this centralized, controlled under the CSC PRC? And it just didn't work because American institutions all sought their own ways of accessing China. That I'll let you answer it first, but since I negotiated the restoration of academic exchanges agreements, I'll come in afterwards.
Well, let me say hi, Tom, but one question is certainly that the US government expected to have a tit for tat like the Soviet program, one for one, and the US government was surprised that the Chinese were able to more closely deal with whomever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And the numbers grew as a result. The US government did have to back down from that position. I think that the second part of the question is indirectly, I think we were a little tough. I think we did not realize how decimated particularly the Chinese social sciences were in the 70s, but also the natural sciences. And so we had a rather tough negotiating position, even though the numbers were not reciprocal. Tom.
Yes, hello, and thanks, Tom, for the question. That I ended up playing a funny role, or unique role in the negotiations. Is when the United States decided it wanted to restore academic exchanges, because that had enormous symbolic importance on the Chinese side. That was the symbol of true willingness to support the drive for modernization. You may recall it being a part of Deng Xiaoping's dialogue with Carter when he came in 1979. I was an unofficial trial balloon guy for the Carter administration. And since the federal government had only 5 universities, all of which were military institutions, and we were not about to begin exchanges with West Point, Stanford became the pilot and the proxy for state and private education systems. And here the goal, the explicit goal, and my instructions were to, as quickly as possible and from the beginning, put China on the same footing as every other country that wanted to send and did send programs. So the Chinese wanted a special program. Now, we're special. And the US position represented by me was, it won't work if you're special. You got to follow the same rules as Mexico or Indonesia or anybody, otherwise it can't work. And when the Stanford Academy of Sciences agreement was concluded in October of 1978, it was not between American students at Stanford, it was between Stanford students and China. We had an immediate issue because of an Indian graduate student who wanted to go to China. But the larger open up the door for Chinese to interact and American institutions across it to interact with Chinese counterparts, can't control this thing, don't want to try and control this thing. And the guidelines that got written were prepared when I went to work for Mary. And these were prepared at the behest of the U.S. government for all universities across the United States, that we thought we wanted to have control, but very quickly the recognition that American universities were not going to take those kinds of instructions from Washington.
Right.
Can I just add one piece of color in this? I have a very strong recollection that when Frank Press, the president's science advisor, went to China, I believe it was in May of '78, but in the middle part, he had been talking to his Chinese counterparts, and they had expressed the desire to send, I believe the number was 500, but anyway, there was a number. And it was a lot bigger number than we expected to hear. And Dr. Press, in my recollection, felt he needed to talk to the president in the middle of the night to ascertain whether he could tolerate such a large number, presumably. And I think that the president expressed a little exasperation getting awakened in the middle of the night, but basically dismissed it as whatever number. And it seemed to me at the time the key issue was that the American taxpayer not pay for this, that however this was going to be financed, it had to be, as you say, Tom, through regular competitive means and regular application processes and so forth. So my sense has always been that this was one of President Carter's more far-seen, impactful strategic decisions, that we would not treat China as we did the Soviet Union. Do I have a correct recollection there?
You do, Mike.
Yep. Pretty correct.
Okay. We have a question. It comes from Jennifer. What connection has there been between governmental U.S. China relations and the societal context that we've all referenced? We just spoke to government facilitation of academic exchanges that took on a life of their own and became very varied and very fruitful. But of course, there are many, many other dimensions of societal interaction, including firms, manufacturing firms, agricultural sales, service industries there. Anybody wish to tackle that one?
Well, let me try. I think that when we started, the government was important in a part in setting the general framework, but American academics and social organizations quickly shed the government. And I think that you used to read about the government would have this and that problem at a time when you didn't have so many problems elsewhere. I was, however, surprised when I read about the 2017 NGO law that the private sector called on the government, called on the president of the country to intercede. And so I think that now the dice, you might say, has changed, and there is more of a relationship with the government when times are really, really tough.
Another illustration of that I referenced briefly in my remark is the business community, American business community, which, and this is metaphorical, not specific documentable cases here, but having spent kind of decades in this relationship, every presidential cycle in the United States, there's a round of China bashing. It might be both sides bashing the policy, or the out of power bashing the in power. party. After each election, and metaphorically here, the business community came to the winner and said, this campaign rhetoric stuff is fine. Congratulations for being elected. And now get real. This is about real money. This is about business relationships, production change that took a long time to put in place. Now cool the rhetoric and get out of the way. That was usually followed by problems in the economic and trade arena. And having spent some of this time in the government would reach out to private sector and say, you having problems? Do you think we can help? And the answer always was, please stay out of the way. Don't politicize it. We can handle this in a business to business way. And that prevailed until President Obama's second term.
Right.
And then, in essence, the business community, single firms and collectively said, we need your help. That we probably could still solve this using our own commercial means, but the risk to our commercial interest is much too high. So you, Washington, take this on and solve it for everybody. You run the risk, you pay the price, and we'll applaud loudly. And don't forget who pays for politics in the United States. And that was the attitude, using the political process at the point of there's a transition from Obama to Trump. And it wouldn't have mattered to me, it wouldn't have mattered who was president after 2017. These problems were going to have to be tackled. The business community has retreated, and it now doesn't want so much help from Washington because it sees it as counterproductive.
Tom?
Yes.
I think I have an example of just the reverse. What you say is exactly true, but the reverse is true.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the government gets in trouble and comes to NGOs to get
Right.
them out of it, to put
Mhm.
it a little crudely, but that's what I think. And I'll give you an example. Tiananmen happens. George Herbert Walker Bush slaps on, because he's got to do something,
Right.
says there are going to be no high-level visits between China and the United States. Well, not long after making that statement, if you conclude China's authoritarian, you need to talk to the authorities in China, and he had just concluded that. So what did they do? They, in fact, come to the NGO sector, I'll say in one case, the National Committee, and asked us if we couldn't help on this issue. As it turns out, mayors are high level in China, but mayors aren't high level in the US. So we could invite a high level mayoral delegation from China that met Chinese need for status, but didn't offend the high level policy here. And in fact, the US government helped finance that program that in fact it couldn't conduct itself.
Right.
So I think one hand washes the other here.
We have just a little bit of time left. I want to go actually to one of the first questions posed, because it makes a good wrap up. That it hangs it on the hook of the meeting in Zurich between Yang Jiechi and Jake Sullivan. I'm not looking for comment on that, but it asks, what should we anticipate? Re-engagement or decoupling? Which way are we headed? Is this book the eulogy for engagement or the case for moving on to, call it engagement 2.0, that takes into account the changed situations on both sides of the Pacific? And I can pick on you because you haven't gotten a chance, but You're muted, Anne.
Mike's title, the title of his chapter is a eulogy. So I think that we need to turn to Mike for this. Although I hope it's wrong.
Well, the way I would approach it is that I said it 4 times, I believe, in my chapter. And that is, I think the repetitive phrase was, engagement as we knew it is dead. But I was trying to make clear that doesn't mean engagement as a generic kind of process is dead, but that the character of that engagement has fundamentally changed. And you might say in the direction that we recognized as a more Cold War-like process. The way I described the change that I anticipate and I see, and in fact, the Secretary of the Navy today gave a major speech on deterring China and the role of the Navy and all its branches in dealing with that. But this change is really, from what I would say, much of that 40 years of engagement was really about reassuring each other about how we would use our power with respect to one another. And now I think in a way we've given up or substantially downplayed reassurance, and now it's a deterrence relationship. And deterrence is about threat. And when you begin to talk about threat, you then have a technological action reaction where everybody's trying to make sure they have a capacity to strike back. So I think we're in for a long period of what we would have recognized in the Cold War is a deterrence type relationship. And I couldn't do anything better than, I don't mean recommend in a normative sense, but suggest you take a look at the Navy Secretary's speech of today or yesterday on deterrence.
Yeah, just a couple of sentences in the remaining time. That the vision of engagement that we've talked about, that I sketched out in my remarks here, of multiple contacts building multiple constituencies with interconnected interests, is not one that was fully shared on the Chinese side. Indeed, I don't think it's inaccurate to say it scared the Chinese. They sought to limit and constrain contacts to push as many of them as possible as far towards the official end of the spectrum as they could. And that one of the indicators of the success of the framework approach that the US has pursued is that it's China that's decoupling. It's China that is reducing access to journalists. It's China that is reducing access to American academic materials. It's China that seeks to have a more autarkic economic, industrial capacity and the like. It's China that is disengaging from the NGO world. The rhetoric in the United States is about decoupling, and Chinese have picked up on the Americans are wrong to try to decouple, but they're doing it, unfortunately, from my perspective. We have reached the end of our allotted time. I thank the 150 or so people who joined us today, and we'll thank everybody on the panel, thank everybody in the audience, and turn this back over to Jean to close out our session.
Thank you very much, Tom. Unfortunately, I can't turn on. Okay, great. Thank you. I just want to thank all the panels. It was a fascinating discussion. I want to thank Anne in particular for editing this volume. It's incredibly rich. And I think you just gotten the taste of this. And I must say, I do hope that Mike Lampton is correct that this is not the end of engagement, but that engagement may take very different forms. So I think that we actually need to pursue what engagement might mean in this very different global contexts. But thank you all very much, and thank the questions from the audience. Good night.